What's going on, you guys? So in the last video, we got the motor completely torn down. Now, in this video, we need to go through and actually measure this motor out. So we're going to check cylinder bore clearances, we're going to measure the pistons. So we're going to go through, plastic gauge the main bearings and rod bearings as well. We got to check clearances on that. And to do that, I actually have a set of standard size bearings, which is what came out of this originally. So we're going to check with standard size bearings, check the clearances, and just make sure that standard size will work for what we have. I'm not sure these are the actual bearings I'm going to use, but it is good to have a set of bearings to measure with. That way you know if you need to order bigger bearings or smaller bearings from what you already have. And you might have remembered that we had a pretty well damaged crankshaft out of this. So pretty deep groove cut in it. Didn't really feel like going through and cutting the crankshaft and taking tons of material off of it. So I went ahead and got another crankshaft for the engine. So right here I have a new LS3 crank. Well, not new, but used LS3 crank that we went ahead and got polished and cleaned up. It looked like it was in pretty good condition originally, so once it got polished and cleaned up, looks really nice. So we're gonna have to go ahead, throw that into the motor and get it all measured up. So I think to start, we need to go ahead and actually measure out the pistons and cylinder bores. So we're gonna get started with that. One thing you might notice is I did put the cam back in there, and that was just temporary. I didn't feel like having it sitting out and getting dirty, and I couldn't find another bag to put it in, so I just decided to toss it in the motor real quick and you know, give it a safe place to sit, not have to worry about damaging it. And we're just gonna go ahead and get this last cylinder here and then start measuring. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is measure all the cylinder bores. So I have my bore gauge here, and basically this just goes in here and you get your measurement. But to start, we're going to take this, figure out what this actually is without any preload on it. So get the exact measurement of this distance right here, and then we go ahead, zero that out on our gauge. And then what I'm doing, I have my iPad right here. What I'm doing is basically I write down the measurement of what that bore gauge is, what that number is, and then as we sweep this, we'll be able to see how much it's actually compressing the bore gauge. So say it's like 57 thou, we take our base number, subtract 57 thou off of that, and that gives us our bore. So we're going to go ahead, do that on multiple different levels of the cylinder and on both directions, just to check for out around, check the bore diameter. As we're doing that, we're going to write down all the numbers we're getting. That way we have something to go back and look at once we measure our pistons. So let's go ahead, get to doing that now. Alright, so we went ahead, measured out the bore on every single cylinder, and good news, they're all right where they should be. So each cylinder is within about like half a thou from each other, like high to low. And for measuring out of round, so this way and this way, basically like cross measuring for seeing if the cylinders are ovaled at all, they're within like half of a thou on the high end. Low end, I think that the tightest one was like 0.2 of a thou out of round, so we should be totally fine with that. Now next thing we got to do is we got our pistons over here. We're going to go ahead, clean them up, get all of any like the oil or debris or anything off of them like that, and then we're going to go ahead and measure the outside diameter of each piston right at the skirt where you're supposed to measure it from, just to see how much clearance we have between the piston skirt and the cylinder walls, and see if we need to send these out or get coated, or if they are good. Now, these used to have a coating on them, and there is no longer a coating on them. So my guess is the coating might have made these actually a little bit too tight to begin with. So I doubt we're going to need to send these out to get coated, but we're going to go ahead and measure them up just in case anyways. Alright, so we got all of our pistons measured out. Pretty much all of them measured at 3.900, and we were down to the tenths of a thousandth. So our biggest one was 3.9005, our smallest was 3.9002, so within 3/10 of a thou. It's pretty good tolerances on the piston. Cylinders measured at 3.9065, so roughly that leaves us roughly 6 thousandths to 6.5 thousandths of clearance between the piston and the cylinder wall, which, you know, that's pretty much right in the ballpark of where we want to be, honestly. So sending these out to get coated, not gonna happen. We don't have nearly enough room for that. I'd have to actually get the cylinders bored out a little if I wanted to get more clearance for coating them. Coating these pistons will actually cause more harm than it will help. So we're just gonna leave them as they are, clean them up, put them back in. Pistons, bores, good to go. Now the next step we need to do is flip this motor over, and we need to measure and check main bearings and rod bearing clearance. If main and rod bearing clearances are good with standard bearings, then we're just gonna put standard size bearings in it, and that's gonna be it. We're just gonna need to replace the rod bearings and main bearings. Yeah, that should do it. So obviously I'm gonna get a closer look at the pistons when I scrub them down and actually clean them all, but spec wise, they are all right within spec, right where they need to be. So now we're gonna get this thing flipped over and measure out those main and rod bearings. Okay, so now that we have the crank set in, we've got our little pieces of plastic gauge set on the crank. Now we got the main caps back on. We're gonna go ahead, torque the caps down, and then as soon as we're done doing that, pop it all back apart. That way we can measure the plastic gauge and see what our clearances are like on standard size bearings. Alright, so far it's all good news. Bores are good, main bearings even checked out, and the bearing clearances are right where we want them to be, right around 2007 inch. So that's perfect. We know that standard size main bearings will work. The bearings that I put in here are actually brand new cleavage bearings, so I'm probably just going to keep these bearings for this crank. But when I did this, you have to check your clearances with the bearings dry, so I still need to pull the crank out, clean the plastic gauge off the cap bearings, clean the plastic gauge off the crank, and then, you know, everything's got to get lubricated with pre-assembly lube before it goes back together. But before we even start thinking about final assembly, we still got to measure the rods up. So we got 8 rods left to do, and as long as all those bearings check out good, I'm going to go ahead and say we just got to gap some rings up for this thing, and it's going to be good to go back together. Alright you guys, so we've gone through, measured everything on this motor now. Rod bearings checked out right around 2,000 inch, so perfect for standard size bearings. Can't use coated ones. Coated ones are a little bit thicker, so we're probably just going to use the bearings I have right now. They're good cleavage bearings. Same thing with the mains. Now the block itself, I'm surprised at how good the block actually held up. Like, I mean, the motor never really had serious overheating issues, so I'm not super surprised, but I mean, it checked out pretty perfect. The pistons were all within like 2 or 3/10 of a thousandth of an inch, so those are all good. The tolerances on the bore to piston were like 6.5 thou, so not enough clearance to ceramic coat the pistons, so we're gonna use the pistons as they are. They're going back in. The main bearings that we spec'd out are good for this motor too, so standard size mains. New crank is perfect. I do need to swap my oil pump gear over, and I am going to be completely disassembling all this again and going back through to clean everything one final time before doing a final assembly with proper engine assembly lube. Now, a couple things you might have seen me not do. I did not check the deck on the heads or the deck on the block to see if they're flat. That is because I do not have my straight edge with me. Once I get my straight edge, I'm going to check the deck clearance and make sure they're still flat and level. And what I usually do to clean up the decks is I have a hand stone, like a fine hand stone, that I will go over and actually hand stone the heads and the block just to get them super clean and make sure the mating surfaces are perfect before assembling it back together. So now that we know the specs of the entire motor and how good and tight everything is, only thing I really need to get are a good set of piston rings for this, and then I'm gonna have to gap the rings out for the boost levels I plan on running with this motor. Other than that, that's about it. Like, for the measurements and stuff I do when checking a motor out to make sure everything's okay before putting it back together. I see a lot of guys build these motors. I see a lot of guys put these motors together and they don't really ever measure anything. They kind of just throw bearings at it or throw whatever into it, and you know, that can lead to some serious issues. Like, we were lucky enough to have a motor setup that doesn't have any serious issues, so we know what all of our clearances are before assembly. So that's 90% of building an engine, is just knowing the specs of everything so you can put it together properly. Don't just throw a bunch of shit on your motor and expect it to work and last forever. You know, you gotta prep everything properly. You gotta make sure everything's super clean, which is why I'm probably not even gonna build it in my garage. I might. Also, keeping everything super clean is very critical, so I will not clean a motor before assembly with these blue rags. Like I was saying earlier, I have a order in for lint-free towels. They're basically t-shirt material towels, and they don't leave little tiny fibers or anything like that behind. So go through, clean the motor out, clean the rods, pistons, sleeves, everything out with those before final assembly. Use some good assembly lube, and we're gonna put this thing back together, and hopefully it makes a lot of power. It made a lot of power before, but I mean, you know, 1,000 horsepower is cool, but 1,200 is cooler. You know, crank the boost up a little bit more. So yeah, all that's left now is order the parts up we need. It's just time and money right now, which I don't have a lot of either to spare, so, but we do have some parts that we know we need to order up to put this thing back together for the final time, and I'll be sure to do a video on the final assembly of this motor. So, but for now, that's gonna be it for this one. So like the video if you liked it, subscribe to the channel if you're new, follow the build along, and until the next one, I'll catch you guys later. Garage is a fucking disaster.